During his campaign, Donald Trump, who is now the 45th president of the United States, among the policies that he said he is going to tighten includes a funding into development countries, developed countries or developing countries, and especially the African continent. You do know that most developing countries, third world countries, depend a lot on aid to function and to spur economic growth. But do we really need this? Yesterday, when Yoweri Museveni, the president of Uganda, was speaking during his meeting with Christine Lagarde, he said right now, as a president, his main focus is to ensure that Uganda does not depend on aid and can fully sustain itself. Having that discussion now with me in studio is James Chikwati. He is an economist with the Interregional Economic Network. He now joins us in studio. A very good evening to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, you've had the sentiments that I've just had to break down Donald Trump's foreign policy, especially to developing countries. We also have Yoweri Museveni's sentiments yesterday. These are sentiments that we've had from other African leaders. But do we really need aid as a continent, as individual countries?
I think, first of all, we have to start by trying to understand what aid is.
Yeah.
You know, aid as an English word, really nobody in his sane mind will say you don't need aid, because aid implies you're being helped to move from point A to point B. But I think when we look at aid the way it is used in the African context and mostly in the poor countries, aid is a sort of business that really promotes the interests of the countries that give the donor money. So when you start looking at it from the point of view that the donor has some interests they want to achieve, then you ask yourself, is the recipient country also fulfilling its own interest in the process? So if you use Museveni's point, you notice that you cannot attain self-reliance if your citizens are not productive enough, paying taxes that can make the country then be able to maneuver in terms of trade and business to create the necessary wealth for you to claim that you don't need aid. So it's an area that we have, first of all, to surrender our belief that the word aid really means aid, and then move to it's a business that promotes certain interests from certain quarters.
If at all Donald Trump makes it through his threat of cutting funding in a very considerable way for developing countries, what exactly would this mean for us, especially in the East African region, given the millions of shillings that we get from the U.S.?
Well, U.S. gives Kenya, for example, around $700 million. That's in terms of the official assistance, excluding maybe the other money that might come through the private donations. But we have to remember Donald Trump said he wants to put American first. And if he really wants to put American first, he'll discover that one of the tools America is good at deploying in putting itself first has always been aid. So as a Kenyan or as an African, I wouldn't really panic if I heard him say that, because we still know for America to be first, its interests will have to be met. And for those interests to be met, one of the diplomatic tools that U.S. has been good at is deploying aid. So maybe what we could be looking at is, in the world where America wants to be first, how can Kenya or how can East Africa navigate its interests so that as America achieves its first dream, the East Africans as well are able to achieve their dream.
So really there's no need to panic from African governments and its people as well?
Well, I think we could say the panic could be in the traditional approach. For instance, if now we know there's been a lot of money from the U.S. towards fighting terrorism, towards disease, especially malaria, HIV/AIDS, what we could see is a reformated approach. And Trump being a business person, I think we might see him pushing more for the business to come and address that particular challenge, as opposed to direct monies landing in our country. Because you notice Kenya now, we're talking about corruption, the whole of East Africa, and the impact of aid as a fueler or a driver of corruption is something that has been discussed over the years. So, and we should not forget that the U.S. itself has its own challenges. So I think Trump is trying to address his constituency. So if somebody is addressing his own constituency, we should be losing sleep over our own constituency, which is Kenya, East Africans. What is it we are doing wrong that we have to wait for Trump to come and help us? And yet we have the capability to make Kenyans, East Africans productive enough to be able to raise the so much needed money that we waste through corruption, to be able to address the challenges that we want the donor country to come and fix.
Transparency International the other day released its 2016 Corruption Perception Index, and Kenya, Uganda, Somalia, Burundi are among the worst countries in terms of corruption. And even as we talk about self-reliance, how are we going to make this possible? Do you foresee a time when African countries would be completely self-reliant?
I foresee a possibility of that, especially when we as Kenyan citizens can stand up and tell our politicians that they have no right to put their pictures on a publicly funded project. Because corruption starts when you have a politician claiming that a project belongs to them, and yet they are using your tax money to fund that project.
Like they're doing you a favor.
Yes.
For giving them that job.
Once you surrender that space to allow a politician to lie to you that it's him or her who did project A or B using your money, that's how corruption starts. So the day the public say, wait a minute, this belongs to us, shut up, we employed you to simply implement. We cannot hire somebody, let's say like a taxi driver, to move you from point A to B using your fee or the payment. Then he starts claiming that this is what I've done because of his money. So here basically what we're looking at is that the public has to start pushing back against the political class that is misusing our funds, and then at the same time come parading with billboards to say I did A, B, C, D, when in essence it's our money, we employed them to go and deliver a particular service, and we have the mandate to fire them if they do not deliver on that service.
Many economists have mentioned aid as one of the biggest demons that African countries and developing countries have had to deal with. I once read a book by Dambiza Moyo on why Africa doesn't really need aid, and many economists have reiterated on the same sentiments by Dambiza Moyo. Is corruption the only thing that makes aid the worst thing to happen to us because of our very own governments?
Well, corruption is one, but there's the point of self-confidence and the point of, as I've said, surrendering to the other. For example, if you wanted to host a meeting today with, let's say, some people to discuss a solution to a challenge that is facing them, similar to what a university does when they call you to go and study a degree, they expect you to pay for that fee. But if you call a meeting under the scenario where we have a lot of donor money, you'll get that the person who is supposed to benefit from that service will be busy asking you to pay them to come and get the skill that they need. So there's a point that it compromises our self-confidence. It makes us surrender our creativity to somebody else. So you'll discover, like what Ugandan president said about self-reliance. You'll notice when he wants to solve a problem, he'll go for an expert from outside, not from Uganda.
Not from within.
The same for Kenya, you know, because now you believe the source of the money has the expertise. So you take people to school, they graduate, now you talk about doctors, and you'll get that nobody's paying attention that this is an investment the country had, and we don't want to waste that kind of investment. But because we are relying on a donor, the donors could be queuing ready to help you. But they are not really helping. They have their own interests. They want to grow their markets. They want to bring their goods. You notice now, East Africa, we are good in consuming goods made from somewhere else. And the donor, you know, will come and our newspapers, KTN perhaps, would be announcing how many billions we've received from World Bank, from IMF, without querying that what are these billions coming to do and which kind of industry is this billion trying to drive. But you know, if we develop intrinsically, which means we tap into our potential of skills and talent, it will mean you'll start prioritizing what kind of project, what kind of development activity you'd wish to have, as opposed to waiting for a donor to come and tell you you need an airport, or you need Lamu Port, or you need standard gauge railway, and maybe your priority might not necessarily be that.
Let's take it back to Kenyans, Tanzanians. People at the grassroots levels, you've mentioned some things about understanding how things work, and politicians are not doing you a favor, leaders are not doing you a favor because you pay them at the end of the day in form of taxes. Do we have enough education for residents or for the public to just understand how this works? Does the person down at the grassroots level know how aid works, how particular funding works, if at all it reaches them?
Actually, you'll be surprised that the ordinary person knows it so well. And that's why if you looked at the percentage of formal vis-a-vis informal economy, you'll get close to 80% of East Africans are business people, but in the informal sector. You know, it's a signal they are rebelling against the system, a system that would largely cushioned by aid. And therefore, you get that when the government is structuring its economic system, cushioned by aid, they exclude others who do not agree to the aid architecture. So the informality becomes a response to that. So they don't want to pay tax, they don't want to have the licenses, because I know IMF will say all these people need to have licenses, pay taxes in a certain way. So informality in East Africa and largely in Africa is a signal that tells us that there's an economic system, that the aid system is perpetuating, that the ordinary person understands and is rebelling against. And therefore, I think part of the issue, if we follow what the president of Uganda said, for self-reliance, is to figure out how to have a system where the people who run to the informal side can find joy to be in the formal side, so that whatever wealth they generate, they don't feel like they're generating the wealth for somebody else. Because as we gave the example of the politicians, you pay the tax, somebody's putting up a classroom, and they put the image of themselves on that classroom and say, I brought this classroom. So people go to the informal side. They'd rather keep that money under the radar so that you don't start bragging around that you did projects in the name of their money.
Given the many years that African governments have been receiving aid, it boils down to about trillions of shillings that have come into the continent, specifically into the East African region. As an economist, do you think African countries, especially in the region, have much to show for the trillions of shillings that have trickled down to them?
When it comes to productivity, I think I would say there are question marks as to where this aid money went. When I say in terms of productivity, is we are consuming from other countries. And we are not seeing our goods on the shelves of the so many supermarkets that are coming up. There's so many technologies that we use. They're all coming from outside. So in that context, I query the role of the aid over the decades that we've seen. But what I foresee is that, and why I wouldn't be so much worried about Trump, is now that there are so many countries competing to give money. Remember China. If America slows down, China can give you 10 times. So and remember aid as a diplomatic tool. It means that the countries will just simply modify how they want to engage. And I think the challenge is on us Kenyans, on us East Africans, to ask ourselves, how do we leverage on these interests that these countries are having? You know, the way they do in judo, use the weight of your opponent to get what you need. So you see, our opponent, if I may use that illustration, is this donor country, wanting to achieve certain goals that are not necessarily ours. But you see, if we think strategically, we can use their weight against their interests so that then we grow. And China did that. If you look at its
and it's working, actually.
Now it has become a donor country in itself.
Wow, wait a way to finish this interview. Thank you very much for coming in and enlightening us on that. James Shikwati is an economist with the Inter-Regional Economic Network, and he says probably we need a change of strategy for ourselves as East Africans. But thank you very much, James, for coming in.